Greetings, this is the Grumpy Old Slan, and today we're taking a look at the November 1923 issue of Weird Tales. So the cover is suitably creepy. We have what seems to be a vampire, a ghost, some skeletons hanging on the walls. I've no idea if this is part of a story. As we've seen in the last few, the cover didn't seem to be of any particular story. It was just there to give a feel to the magazine to attract buyers. While the topic I think is suitable, the execution is very poor. That poor vampire is missing a big chunk of his body. His legs seem to meet at the rib cage. There's no reason for this. This is just a bit of effort. A bit more work would have done wonders to this cover. In any case, let's dive in. Now, once again, the table of content is way at the end. There's 15 stories, 2 serials, and a nonfiction article, and we'll get into all of those in order. The first story being Draconda. This one is science fiction. We might call it science fantasy today, about 3 compadres, one of whom finds a way to generate anti-gravity. He builds a spaceship. They all 3 get in, fly to Venus. The tale is entertaining enough, even though the science isn't. They do foresee a few things, that the Earth from space is blue. And they reference how we knew this ahead of time by examining the light reflected by Earth on the moon. They do lose weight under the effect of gravity. They don't talk about free fall. It's just as you're further from Earth, you weigh less because Earth is further away and its gravity field is lessened. The trip to Venus does take quite a bit of time. One of the chapters is called The 12th Day, and it's far from the end of the trip. At least they didn't have the heroes zoom over to the nearest planet in a day or two. It is a trip of several weeks, which is still extremely fast, but I'm willing to forgive a 100-plus-year-old story that was written before spaceflight was a thing, before the first rocket experiments, and when all of that was all theoretical. I did enjoy it. It was quite fun. The tale ends with them landing on Venus. We're going to find out what happens to them after. Now, Draconda is apparently, and I'm not 100% sure of this, the name of a woman, presumably on Venus. We will have to wait until the next issue to find out for sure. Next, we have The Crawling Death. This one's about a couple of real estate agents. They're tasked to rent out a house by someone who will be traveling abroad for a while. The house is apparently haunted. They're told that they shouldn't go into a particular room, and yet they're given the key to that room, and they're told to give the same instructions and the key to the tenants. One of the 2 realtors believes in the supernatural while the other one doesn't, and they are going to try to find out what's happening, what's in the room. It turns out that the owner of the house, and it's his ancestral house, has these very large hands, and one of his ancestors strangled someone and had his hands cut off, and the hands still haunt the house. It's a fairly standard haunting tale, except for the fact that it's the hands that are separate from the rest of the ghost and move around and strangle its victims. It was an okay tale. Next, we have The Closed Room by Maybelle McCalmont. I should try to mention the author of stories more often. So this story is about a psychologist, and one of his school-time friends will be acting quite strange. His wife is very worried. After some travel, the doctor is called in for consultation about the wife, who all of a sudden refuses to be touched by her husband, does not want to see him, goes into hysterics when he's there. And he will talk with her. She will say why she's acting that way. And it turns out that in their quite nice, large suburban house, they have a wing which has a room in it that no one can enter except the woman's husband, the psychologist's college friend. and he will refuse to have anyone else enter it under any circumstance. However, the wife is curious and she manages to sneak a peek through a crack in the curtains. She tells the psychologist about it and he agrees to look into it. Eventually, he will confront his old friend about it. As it turns out, the friend has been keeping the skeleton of his first wife there and treating it like it's alive, buying it clothes and jewelry. When a psychologist enters the room with him, he talks to her as though she were alive the whole time. Having lost everything, the man will attempt suicide. However, he will just die before the gun that he has will go off. He's dead, but not by his own hand. It seems his heart stopped. One of the more interesting things about it is that the last name of the man who keeps his first wife's body in that room is Norman. I could instantly draw parallels to Robert Bloch's Psycho. So I have no idea if he read this issue of Weird Tales or not, if it had any influence on it. It's well known that the first issue he read was about 3-4 years away in 1927. He might never have read it. I thought that was an interesting little coincidence. The next story is called The Phantom Violinist, about a young violinist. Everyone in his family will be very musically inclined, to the point where almost all of them play the violin. This is told from the point of view of a journalist who will talk to this young man after a strange occurrence at a concert of his. After a bit of a rocky start, he plays a piece of music that is not on the program. Somebody screams, yells out in the audience. The violinist then steps forward, points at the man, and said, "There is the murderer of Joel Daziel," who turns out to be the violinist's uncle and who died in particularly awful circumstances. Basically, he was at his father's house, the violinist's grandfather. One day he disappeared and no one knew where he was. The grandfather just kept searching for him in the nearby woods, and one day he found an old cabin, and inside he sees a body almost entirely decomposed. It's more of a skeleton with bits still attached to it, which he recognizes because of the clothes and other personal items, including a violin, of course, that his son had with him. At one point, the musician in question will get his uncle's violin, given to him by his grandfather. While he normally doesn't use it, the night of the recital he did use it because his regular instrument had a problem of some sort. He starts to hear the music, and eventually this will lead to the events at his recital. It was that melody that he kept hearing that he played. He's not sure why. What's interesting with this story is they actually say we don't have an explanation for this, and they leave it open in a very explicit way. Whereas most stories of this kind will sort of try to hint what it could be. This story actually ends with the words, "Can you explain it? I could not, and today I'm no nearer to its solution." So that's a very explicit way of putting things for a ghost story, which I feel to be successful must rely on ambiguity. The next story is Lucifer by John D. Swain. The title doesn't seem quite appropriate. It's not so much about Lucifer as someone who worships Lucifer, specifically a man who is brought in by a desperate parent who has a crippled child. The spine and the limbs are twisted, the boy can barely move, and this very ordinary looking man, kind of meek in a way, shows up. He's the last resort. He's a devil worshipper. He says that he, or more precisely, he whom he serves, will be able to cure things, but he warns him that you may not like the way it is done, and that there is no going back once he starts the ceremony. And yes, indeed, the boy's body is entirely cured. He seems healthy. The only problem is that he looks like a healthy body because he is now dead. While everyone is in shock, the man leaves without them noticing it, and that's the end of the story. I thought it was quite good, short to the point, not quite what we expect, and well told. I think this is one of the better stories in this issue so far. The Spider by Arthur Edwards Chapman about a man who's just been to an estate sale, it appears, and he's purchased a bunch of antiques. One of the items he purchased was a small golden spider with diamond eyes. He's not quite sure why he bought it. He felt he was compelled to buy it, even though it looks kind of creepy and strange. He will go to bed that night. He will not be able to sleep very well. He will hear some noise, and it will turn out to be a giant spider that is slowly approaching him and that will attempt to kill him. And he will fight it off with limited success until his hand touches upon a metal object, which turns out to be a poker from the fireplace. He will use it to hit the spider and kill it. He will, however, pass out, and when he wakes up, there's no sign of the giant spider, but the tiny little sculpture he had bought is now smashed to pieces. An okay story, some details were off, it didn't grab me too much, a bit predictable maybe. Next, we have the conclusion of The Amazing Adventure of Joe Scranton by F.E. Fifield. I wasn't super thrilled with it. This was about the man who would astralize himself, leave his body, and his body being taken over by someone else. And this is his efforts to try and get his body back, which he does manage. However, in the meantime, the person who took over his body has landed his body in prison. Because he hit his wife. She started divorce proceedings, which are concluded. He tries to explain to her that he wasn't himself and why, and people kind of take this as a joke and it's a ridiculous excuse. I find the character was overly naive in his outlook. The story ends with him determined more than ever, now that he's finished his prison sentence and lost almost everything, he's determined more than ever to rebuild his life and get back together somehow with his now ex-wife. I wasn't in love with the first half of this story, and I must say it's the same with the second half. Not my kind of thing. The Iron Room by Francis Grierson, and this is subtitled Another Paul Pry Story. The previous issue had The Case of the Golden Lily, which was the first Paul Pry story. And as with that story, I didn't particularly enjoy it. It's sort of a detective story, Paul Pry being the detective in question, but the reader is not given enough information to be able to come up with an explanation himself. That's one of the things I like in a good detective story, is that maybe I figured it out, probably I haven't, because I tend to not be able to. Once I have the solution, I can see that all the information I needed was there. Whereas here, it's never given properly. It just didn't work for me again. And I know this will turn out to be the second of only 2 Paul Pry stories, so I guess the character didn't become popular enough to warrant another sequel. In any case, this one is about him being called to investigate someone's disappearance. And it turns out that where he was staying, which was quarters provided by the company he works with, was an iron building, and it's partly his home, but it's also his lab. All the walls are made out of plates of iron. I'm not sure I understand why. And the building was built over an old abbey that has been slowly converted by the company for their purposes. The man disappears, no one quite knows why, and it turns out that he set up this very elaborate trap in order to kill a rival of his who is engaged to the woman the man who disappeared was in love with. Except that, like many very fancy and elaborate traps, the wrong person, namely the woman, was going to spring it, and he manages to save her, but he falls himself victim to his own trap. He has to push her away, and she falls. She gets knocked unconscious, so she doesn't know what happened to him. No one has seen him in a couple of days, and when Paul Pry somehow figures it all out, they find his body dead from the effects of the trap. As I mentioned before, kind of a disappointing detective story. I'm not surprised to find out that there were no other Paul Pry stories published afterwards. The next story is by Paul Sutter, Prisoners of the Dead. This one is about a young man who lives with his uncle, who's quite old, and who refuses to give his consent for this man to marry the woman he's in love with. The uncle will say, well, I want you to make me a solemn oath that you will not have anything to do with her as long as I'm in this house. The man, figuring his uncle is really old, agrees to, because he figures it won't be long, then I'll be able to get married to her. Shortly after, the uncle passes away. However, the young man has visions of his uncle. He asks one of the staff in the house if he sees anything, and the staff says, no, I'm not seeing anything but the furniture. What are you talking about? He goes, there in the chair is my uncle. Basically, he thinks he's being haunted. He will then ask the woman he loves. He will explain to her what's happening, and she says, well, I'll go with you. Your uncle said you can't have anything to do with me as your bride, but I can be there as a consultant because I know some things about the occult. They will go, and she will quickly figure out that it's not a ghost he's seeing, it's just a wax statue. And the staff was promised a large amount of money in the will of the uncle on the condition that his nephew did not marry the woman. So they were trying to drive him insane by having this wax statue be there, pretending they didn't see anything. His fiancée solves the problem and they get married, and that's the end of the story. Competently written, an interesting one. You do think it's going to get into some sort of ghost haunting story, but it doesn't, which was a bit refreshing. It's the kind of story that shows why Paul Sutter was a fairly regular contributor to the pages of this magazine, even though he's maybe not remembered as much today as he should be. Next, we have The Dead Pit by Oscar Schisgall. This one's about a couple. They're farmers and they're not doing too well. There's been a drought. They're short on money. Their son is very sick. He's feverish. The man gets home quite late. The wife asks him to go call the doctor. He refuses because he actually went to the doctor's house and burglared it. However, their son is getting worse, so they will call the doctor who will come. However, the son, being delirious and having heard the discussion his parents had, spills the bean. This angers the doctor. He'll fight with the man, and the man will kill him, and then hide the body in a nearby well that's dried up. They can't hide the fact that the doctor was there, but they will pretend that he left and they thought he was home. The son, again, overhears all this. These people don't seem to be too clever and keep discussing their plans in front of a feverish boy. The boy wants to go see the body in the well, and the story ends with the couple discovering that their son went outside and fell into the well, and his body is down at the bottom along with that of the doctor. So this is another one of those stories that aims to be more grisly than anything else. It's quite long. It does have some good characterizations, but if you're looking for something supernatural to happen, you're not going to find it in this one. The Wax Image by Burton Harcourt, however, does have some supernatural of some sort. It concerns a man who is friends, if you will, with a local Chinese who sells him opium. He will find out that Sam Wong, who is his friend, or at least his dealer, really dislikes another Chinese person who lives nearby called Ah Fu. He actually has a wax statue of Ah Fu, and in front of the narrator, he will shoot this statue. He will find out later that Ah Fu died at the exact moment that the wax figure of him was shot. It's a rather short story. The entire story has a situation. It's built up quite nice. The protagonist doesn't see what's going to happen coming at all. He still can't explain it by the end of the story. Yeah, that was an enjoyable one. Maybe not the best, but certainly we've seen worse in the pages of Weird Tales before. So, next is Poison by Farnsworth Wright. He's had quite a good variety of stories. It seems he's trying his hand at a bit of everything. It will, I think, serve him well when he takes over editing of the magazine in about a year. It was sometimes in 2024. I'd have to look up when exactly. This one concerns two men who's both named Aubrey. One is a lawyer, the other one's an apothecary, and they get into a fight. The fiancé of one of them, trying to patch things up, makes things worse, and they stop talking and seeing each other. However, at some point, the apothecary needs some legal papers dealt with, and since the papers are with the lawyer, he has to go see them. However, meantime, he found out from another apothecary that the lawyer has purchased a large quantity of poison. When they show up, the lawyer insists that they drink some wine, pre-prohibition vintage, as it's called in the story. The lawyer will put the poison in his own glass, and then, pretending he needs to go, will leave the room for a few minutes. He comes back, they have a toast, drink the wine. The poison does take a short while before it takes effect, and they're still talking, and the lawyer is getting worse. He basically asks the apothecary outright, "Did you switch the glasses?" And the apothecary says yes, and to make sure it would work, I added some more poison too. What he doesn't realize is that by switching the glasses, he himself also drank the poisoned wine. They basically both will be found dead in the lawyer's office. Again, another one that doesn't have any supernatural elements. It was very well executed, so quite the enjoyable read. The switching of the poisoned glasses is such a classic trope. We've seen it so often. The fact that the lawyer puts the poison in his own glass, expecting the apothecary to switch it, shows that it was already a well-known plot point. Next we have The Magic Mirror by Mary S. Brown. And this one's about a man who stays for the summer in a rented house. Through a mirror, he sees a girl, and he will find out that the girl is actually in the mirror, that it's the daughter of the man who lives in the neighboring house. They have some interaction. He talks to her. He tells her father eventually what has transpired. And after a few days, he will get a message saying he must come to his neighbor's house urgently. When he gets there, the housekeeper and him find the girl in her old room, lying on the bed, but her father is now nowhere to be seen. And it turns out that he had found a way to go into higher dimensions using what they call vibrations. He had sent her there, but he couldn't bring her back, and now he'd found a way. However, he had to stay in the mirror dimension in order for his daughter to come back. There's a bit of a tragic ending. Unlike a lot of stories that have hauntings or similar things, it doesn't go for fear, it just goes for mystery. A refreshing take when compared to a lot of the stories in this magazine. Stories like The Invisible Monster, which is about a crew that captures a huge and very strange looking monster. Essentially looks like a fish, but it seems to have stubby legs. It's like 50 feet long and 10 feet in diameter. People who examined it believe it might not be a fully grown specimen and that it must come from very deep in the ocean. The captain of the ship decides to tour with it and try to cash in on people curious to see the sea beast. At some point, they will see some ripples in the water. They'll hear a scream. Someone will throw a lifeline out. It will seem to sink, and people will try to pull it out. Others will join them. And then to their horror, they find that not only can they not pull it out, they can't even let go of the rope, and they're slowly being pulled in the water until eventually they all disappear, including the captain of the ship that captured the creature. And that's it. It does have hints of the unknowable horror and unknown horror that we see. Maybe a bit better executed in authors like Lovecraft, but other people have done it too. The fact that no attempt has been made to explain it is one of the things that I find makes this story better. It's a lesson that's slowly being learned by a variety of writers in the pages of this magazine, and it's one that I'm happy to say they're taking to heart. The Pebble Prophecy is about a couple friends come over for the holidays, and because they sort of live out of town and some people it takes them time to go, it's not just for the evening for supper, but it's all afternoon. They'll play games. And one of the things they play is what they call the Pebble Prophecy, in which you build a bonfire. Under the bonfire, everybody puts a small pebble. And if the heat and movement of the fire causes the pebble to move, it means that death will come in the following year to whoever had placed that pebble under the bonfire. That's exactly what happens to the narrator, and they will have an otherworldly encounter with the ghost of an old lady that used to live in this house. And the next thing they know after fainting is that their friends are around them asking what happened. They heard a cry, a scream, and they don't know. They only had this vision of this ghost trying to strangle them. And then when they look at the portrait of the old lady that lived in this house and whose ghost he had seen, it appears that the person in the portrait is gone. Okay, I guess. I think the most interesting part is this Pebble Prophecy game or divining or whatever it is, which I'd never heard of. So I don't know if it was made up for the story or if it's just something that we've forgotten about. Next, we have another masterpiece of weird fiction, and this one is The Telltale Heart by Edgar Allan Poe, one of his shorter works and an excellent story. I don't think I need to go over what it's about. If you've never read it, go read it now. It's very good. A good exploration of madness and how people who are mad don't believe they are. And finally, we have the second Weird Crimes article by Seabury Quinn. This one is titled The Grave Robbers, and it doesn't concern itself with what we often picture when we think of grave robbers. It talks about a large number of families who were robbed while they were at a funeral. The police then managed to arrest the culprit, who would basically telephone the house after having noted in the obituaries page of the paper when a funeral was. If somebody would answer, he would just claim to be a friend of the family and offer his condolences. And if there was no answer, he'd try again 5 minutes later. And if again there was no answer, he'd know there was nobody there and he would burgle the place. There's a brief mention of somebody else who did something similar. However, he wouldn't call ahead, so he got caught. And then it talks about an undertaker who would sell caskets for burial and shortly after dig out the casket, put the body back in the grave, fill up the grave again, and then resell the casket again. How much of this is true, I don't know. This one feels less like a piece of fiction than the previous one. However, it does show some interesting and odd things that people do in real life. This has been the Grumpy Old Slan, looking at the November 1923 issue of Weird Tales, and I'll see you next time.